Hello everybody, my name is Fagun Kaushik and the topic of my research is identifying gaps in the implementation of Indigenous ways of knowing in the elementary Ontario science curriculum. So my reflexive positionality statement comes from my passion of science and the natural environment around me. As a former student, I was taught the scientific concepts in a very specific colonial approach, and so this trained me to look at nature through a very specific lens. But I do wonder how I would look at the world had I been taught through various other perspectives. And so I think Indigenous integration is needed in a more meaningful way in the Ontario science curriculum. And through my research, I hope to explore how Indigenous perspectives can help identify gaps in the Ontario science curriculum. So, my research questions are as follows. My main question is on how can Indigenous ways of knowing be further integrated into the Ontario Science curriculum to further enhance student scientific learning experience. And my first question is, in what ways is the Indigenous ways of knowing currently integrated in the Ontario Science curriculum? The second is on how Indigenous ways of knowing are integrated within the science curriculum documents in other Canadian provinces. And my last question is on how integrating Indigenous knowledge can impact inclusivity and equity for all students, including Indigenous students. So, for my criteria, I chose to look at the Canadian provincial curriculum documents, specifically from the provinces of Saskatchewan and British Columbia, which will then be used to compare with Ontario science curriculum. For this focus of this particular research, I focused on the elementary level for grades 1 to 6. So I'll now be talking a little bit about the curriculum documents and their organizations. So in Ontario, the science curriculum was last revised in 2007, and as we all may be pretty much familiar with it, it's been organized, within overall expectations and specific expectations. So the Saskatchewan document was last revised in 2011, and similar to Ontario, it's got outcomes and indicators. So outcomes serve a similar function to overall expectations, and the indicators provide more details, like in the specific expectations of the Ontario curriculum. PLASI for British Columbia, they last revised their science curriculum document in 2016, and they have their information organized within curricular competencies and the content. So again, the curricular competencies are similar to overall expectations and the content is similar to specific expectations. They also have elaborations for each if you wanted to find more details for each of them as well. So for this, I'll now be talking more about my literature review. So my research topic in year 1 was about experiential learning in the outdoors, which is useful because it is hands-on, but it fails to acknowledge Indigenous communities as well as the first stewards of the lands here, especially in North America. And so Indigenous education can help fill the gaps by decolonizing the current scientific views that we have in the curriculum, and it shifts away from the Eurocentric way of thinking. It also looks at challenging the binaries and other kinds of racism that are embedded in the Eurocentric colonial point of view. The impact of Indigenous ways of knowing in the science curriculum on students is positive, on both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, but obviously Indigenous students do feel included, and they are able to gain the necessary skills to obtain a successful career, and they can gain tools that you need to survive in a Eurocentric world without losing their culture or heritage. And so I'll now be talking about my findings. So, the current status of the Ontario curriculum is as follows. So, there were very, very few comments of the Indigenous ways of knowing, approximately 25 comments, and a lot of those were mainly found in the curriculum's biological strands, such as plants. Interestingly, we saw a prevalence of the term Aboriginal throughout the curriculum. Very few mentions, if any, were given about the information given by Indigenous communities when designing the curriculum, and so overall, the current findings of the Indigenous ways of knowing was quite limited. Meanwhile, in the Saskatchewan curriculum, Indigenous people were mentioned as First Nations or Métis here, and there was a lot more meaningful integration of Indigenous knowledge across various different topics like human health, building shelters, light, etc. There was a theme of interconnectedness as well, and the curriculum encouraged the use of multiple resources when teaching about the Indigenous ways of knowing, so things like picture books, interactions with elders, naturalists, videos, etc. were encouraged when teaching about these concepts. Similarly, in British Columbia, they use the term First Peoples when referring to Indigenous communities. Again, a similar theme of emphasizing connection between people, place, and interconnections. A lot of meaningful integration into other different scientific topics as well, as we can see here. I also saw an input of Indigenous knowledge on different kinds of applications of sustainability as well. And similar to Saskatchewan, a lot of integration across multiple types of media like storytelling, visual arts, music, dance, etc. So implementing Indigenous knowledge does have a positive impact on equity and diversity. It enables students and teachers to learn and experience this scientific knowledge from different Indigenous perspectives. Indigenous knowledge can also complement Eurocentric Western knowledge as well, so they both can go hand in hand. It is important that students also understand different perspectives, as this can help them respect the different cultures around them as well. It is also quite vital to accurately portray Indigenous ways of knowing in classroom, and so curriculums also had additional suggestions and guidance for teachers to use. Due to the multiple approaches that we can use to teach Indigenous knowledge, I think that it can be implemented very well with universal design learning and differentiated instruction. And it really just allows students to experience science in a more hands-on and different manner. And all of these experiences are somewhat stifled in the Ontario Science curriculum currently because of a lack of proper integration of Indigenous knowledge. And so I will now be talking briefly about my discussion section. So, as outlined in the reading above as well, Indigenous students do feel represented in their classrooms. Students get an opportunity to experience science in an experiential, hands-on way, and teaching outdoors really gives students a sense of place amongst nature. And we really see a theme of interconnectedness also between the Indigenous ways of knowing and the Western perspectives as well. So I'll now be talking about my limitations and next steps. So one of my limitations was that I used very few documents in this analysis, so I only used 3 documents. And for my next steps, I would like to analyze curriculums and school systems in other colonized countries as well. I think it would be interesting to look at the approaches that they have used in the US, Australia, and New Zealand. I would also want to look at integration of Indigenous knowledge across other subject areas as well. And I would like to interact with educators and teachers on their perspectives on applying these crucial topics in their subject areas. And I would also want to have an opportunity to understand the perspectives of Indigenous knowledge holders and elders as well on their viewpoints of incorporating these Indigenous perspectives. And so I'll now be talking about conclusions and recommendations. So in conclusion, there are current gaps in the Ontario Science curriculum that do pose substantial drawbacks for students. We saw various different ways of representation across curriculums in British Columbia and Saskatchewan, and these do provide great potential for differentiated instruction and universal design learning. For recommendations, one thing that does come to mind is the continuous fear that educators have of incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing in their classrooms due to being unintentionally being disrespectful, unintentionally teaching something that they're not supposed to. And so a recommendation that comes to mind would be to create a professional development course for teachers. Obviously, this would have to be designed by Indigenous knowledge holders or elders in order for teachers to truly have that authentic experience in how to incorporate these crucial topics in their classrooms. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.